Let me begin with something I think is important. I've spent my entire adult life as an independent voter, not Republican, not Democrat, independent. I've voted for candidates from both parties over the years. I've agreed with Republicans on some issues and Democrats on others. I've spent decades as an educator teaching students how to think critically, not what to think. And before all of that, I served as a combat veteran in the United States military. Why does that matter? Because military service teaches you something that modern politics seems to have forgotten. Standards either matter or they don't. You don't get to change them depending on who's standing in front of you. And that's exactly why the situation surrounding Maine Senate candidate Graham Platner caught my attention. Not because he's a Democrat, not because I support or oppose his candidacy, but because the reaction from many Democratic leaders exposes something bigger: hypocrisy. Now let's be clear. This episode is not about whether Graham Platner deserves forgiveness. Americans believe in second chances. I certainly do. Anyone who has lived long enough understands people make mistakes. The real question is different. If Graham Platner were a Republican, would the reaction from Democratic leaders be the same? Honestly, think about that. If a Republican Senate candidate was facing allegations from former partners, controversies involving explicit communications, questions about personal conduct, and a highly controversial past involving symbols linked to hateful ideologies, would Democratic leaders be telling Americans to focus on policy? Or would they be demanding resignations, investigations, and wall-to-wall media coverage? As an educator, I've spent years teaching students that consistency matters. You cannot enforce one standard for one student and another standard for someone else. The moment you do, you lose credibility, and that's what I think we're witnessing here. For years, Americans have been told, character matters, leadership matters, accountability matters, believe women, take allegations seriously. Again, I don't disagree with those principles. The problem is what happens when those principles become inconvenient. Because principles are easy when they cost nothing. The real test comes when following them becomes politically painful. That's when you find out whether they were actual principles or simply political talking points. And that's where many Americans are becoming frustrated. Not just Republicans, not just conservatives, independents too. Because people can tolerate disagreement. What they struggle with is double standards. When one set of rules applies to one group and a different set applies to another, trust starts disappearing fast. As someone who's spent decades in education, I can tell you students notice hypocrisy immediately. You can lecture about fairness all day long, but if your actions don't match your words, they stop listening. Adults aren't much different. Voters notice. And many voters are looking at this situation and asking a simple question. What happened to all those standards we were told mattered so much? Now, maybe Democratic leaders genuinely believe Graham Platner deserves grace and forgiveness. That's a fair argument. But if that's the argument, then perhaps it's time for a broader conversation about grace, forgiveness, and consistency for everyone. Not just for candidates whose victory helps your party. Because here's the reality. The American people are exhausted. They're exhausted by selective outrage. They're exhausted by political tribalism. They're exhausted by politicians who seem to discover or ignore moral principles depending on the news cycle. And as a lifelong independent, I think that's one reason so many Americans no longer trust political institutions. Not because they disagree with them, because they no longer believe they're being honest. And honesty matters, especially in leadership, especially in public service, especially when you're asking voters to trust you. At the end of the day, this isn't really a story about Graham Platner. It's a story about whether principles still matter in American politics, or whether they only matter when they're useful. And if principles only apply to your opponents, they were never principles to begin with. They were strategies. And Americans are getting very good at spotting the difference. This has been your weekly reality check, where principles should apply equally even when it's politically inconvenient. Thanks for joining the weekly reality check.